All right. Hi, hello, everybody. What we're talking about today is we're going to be just continuing on our discussions about popular culture in the United States. And really, we're going to focus on the differing kinds of experiences that groups had at this time, as well as moving into the impact that this is having on the various different very quickly growing groups in our country, specifically looking at the development of the generation gap between the old and the young, just like we talked about in the 1920s. We're seeing that happening again with this big change that's going on. We'll also talk about a specific group that is in reaction to that growing distance between the old and the young. At the end, I'll go through our little bit of work to be completed, checking in with you guys, make sure that that's all understood. So we're going to start here by talking about inequality in entertainment. So seeing how differing groups of people in our country experience all of that cultural development and all of that really fun change that was happening on the Friday's lecture, and seeing how that is going to be different for different people. We're going to start with African Americans. It's important to understand that African Americans created rock and roll. They are the ones who created this new sound and this new approach to music. And it was an interesting situation, remembering that without someone like Elvis Presley, who cracked open the window a little bit, African Americans, even though they created this highly popular music genre, were not guaranteed to be successful musicians in America during this time. There was still a lot of that resentment towards them, the natural bias that Americans have to other races, in particular African Americans. And many of the genre's greatest performers, they really struggled. They struggled to be able to make it. There's always exceptions. Of course, when I talk about rock and roll of the 1950s, you definitely can think of different African American musicians, whether they're strictly rock and rollers or if they're more, again, like the jazz musicians from the 1920s and 30s who've managed to kind of kick in the door a little bit and be able to gain some popularity regardless of their race. Some pretty big names, I would say, again, Nat King Cole, Lena Horne, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie. These are all examples of African American musicians who had a lot of success, though they still struggle to get it and to be able to keep it. The reaction is not always the same for them. Other modes of entertainment, like we talked about on Friday, also saw this separation. If it wasn't a, again, very specific sort of process, instead of including African Americans equally within movies and television and radio, they started to create things that were specifically and separate. It's just segregation in a more, I guess, entertainment based way. So African American shows, they would get created, but then just broadcast on separate TV stations, radio stations. Just like today, there are some stations that are very specific for groups of people or for genres. That was something that was happening in the 1950s. And you see a lot of things that develop here are going to be highly stereotypical in this day and age, things that you'd be like, wow, how could they even say something like that? But they believed that it was totally fine. Again, still at this time, segregation is perfectly legal in the United States. People didn't see anything wrong with it. So there were different approaches to targeting specific African American audiences in advertising, in the types of programs that they created. Again, they would always be advertising different kinds of products that were more specific to African Americans and the experience that they would have, I suppose. And it made them feel even more different than the rest of their lives did, which, of course, doesn't sit well with everyone for very long. Other groups or specifics, I suppose, in regards to entertainment, thinking sports. Sports at this time are obviously still very important to the American experience. There's the new way to consume sports at this time, which is television, and African Americans had to work twice as hard to make it. Again, a pretty famous example of this would be Jackie Robinson, the first African American to play in the, again, national, again, ooh, I apologize, in the professional levels of the baseball outside of a segregated league, basically. And he still struggled with that again all the time, trying to be taken seriously and given the props that he deserved. The other thing, of course, is that you just didn't see other groups again overall reflected in mainstream programming unless they were exceptional. And again, that is not something that people were going to stand for very much longer. Really, they're starting to organize in the 1950s and to push back a little bit more. And that definitely leads to a lot of more discussions we'll have after this unit is concluded. Overall, the experience of African Americans is just different. They, again, were being kept separate, or they were having to fight so hard to be seen within these different pop culture moments. Again, just like women are treated differently in entertainment, so were minorities at this time. So the next thing we have to talk about is something that's kind of really fascinating to me personally, and that is this idea of generational divide. During the 1950s, that we're seeing a very distinct division start to develop between the older generation, thinking the GI generation, born prior to 1936, the ones who fought in the war, the ones who, again, lived through the Great Depression, and then the younger generation, the baby boomers, and again, this group who are coming of age in a very different time. Their experiences are just they're different to their parents, and that changes them as a group. I mean, they're living through this Cold War where there's this constant fear and panic and all of this different sort of pushing people to be better and to do all that kind of stuff. It's economically just a very prosperous time for a lot of these people, and culturally it's all just changing so fast. And the interesting thing about the experience of baby boomers is that they're going to be going through all of the typical developmental ages, but the age of teenager starts to become much more important in the long run. I'm not saying that becoming a teenager before World War II is not important. It just there wasn't this extra significance to it, but now we see in the 1950s that these kids are able to use that time to really just figure out who they are and what they like, and they do that with, again, kind of abandon for what else is happening there. Again, they're staying in school longer. They don't need to go to work. Most of them are getting allowances, and mass media is recognizing that, and they're producing so much stuff for them. They're a very profitable market. Again, so products that are specific to teens, looking at movies and television and advertising, all of it is gearing towards them. And that changes. It changes the experience and what this younger generation values and what their priorities are going to be. And what we see end up happening is this rift, this sort of the, again, my parents just don't understand me, as a lot of younger generations say. And that's really what's happening here. The old have a very specific experience they're trying to get. They want to fit into the mold. They need to work hard because they know that things have been really bad and they need to do that. They're going to fit into those societal expectations wherever possible. They want the American dream. This new younger generation is kind of more interested in just having fun. They want to consume media, and they want to, again, drive fast cars, and they want to go to the movies, and they want to find their own way. They're really much more of an a much more independent group overall. Both of them, both groups, the whole of America really is living in a brand new age, to be frank, which is something that ties them together. And that's the idea of consumerism. This is a concept that you definitely should put out there, and it's on your review packet, which is buying material goods. Straight up, consumerism is how we live today, is that all the things that we need, we are going to be able to buy. And that's how we do it. We don't make them ourselves. We don't go out and find them. We're going to go and buy them. And that informs a lot of the decision making that we have. Can we afford that? How do we afford that? What is it that we need to do to be able to afford that? Consumerism is the experience of America, and it all starts here in the 1950s. And it has a different impact on the older generation than it does on the new, but still, it is important regardless. One group it's not important to is going to be the Beats. All right. So when it comes right down to it, the 1950s has this interesting counterculture start to develop of this younger generation who they don't they look at the American dream and they don't get it. They don't fit and they don't want to fit. Some of it is because they don't. They simply will not. I mean, when we think about the American dream, it's a very whitewashed version of American society. So the Beat movement is this younger generation pushing back, whether it is because they're not allowed to participate in the American dream or they just don't want to. They don't want to fit into that cookie cutter image of what is what. And this movement is this social and literary non-conformity. They don't want to fit. They purposefully are going to try and do things that are outrageous or not considered okay in this moment in time. And it's a very creative movement. It's artists and poets and writers. They get nicknamed the Beatniks. That's where the name Beat movement comes from, because they march to the beat of their own drum. They're not doing what everybody else is doing. They're just going for it themselves. Where this all began is in big cities, where you see, again, large populations of young, well-educated individuals, thinking San Francisco, LA, Greenwich Village in New York, around Columbia University, in the Times Square, but not the Times Square that you guys know and have seen in television back when it was very seedy and not so nice. They are going to be a group of people who don't want to work the 9 to 5. They are looking for freedoms to be artistic and to express themselves. They don't want to fit into any of that stuff. They're looking for a higher consciousness. So instead of, again, just buying into what everyone says, they're looking for other ways to free their minds, to be able to experience the world around them in a different way. So a lot of them are going to dabble in Buddhism, or of course there's the more experimental stuff like, again, recreational drugs. These are all things that the Beat movement really utilized to try and push out of this sort of expectation for them. Some pretty famous, in my opinion, beatniks, Allen Ginsberg, who is a very famous poet. Howl is probably one of the craziest but also coolest poems I've ever heard. Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road. Bob Dylan, he got his start here in the Beat movement. He was very young when the Beats came on the scene in the 50s, but it informed him as a musician. And of course, it feeds into the counterculture or the hippie movement of the 60s and 70s, which we'll talk about later on. This whole typical American society, they just didn't people didn't understand. Neither of these groups understood each other. The Beats didn't understand why anyone would want to be in the American dream, and the people who were living that very typical American life didn't understand the Beats. They didn't see the appeal of not having a job and struggling to make do. And why would they want to do this? What was be the purpose? Overall, it's just one more example of where you have this kind of divide happening, where the old and the young are not understanding each other. They have different values. They have different priorities. The Beats are just one group or one reaction to that, just like we saw in a lot of the other cultural movements like rock and roll and in movies and all that kind of jazz. So that's it. That's it for today. Again, as far as work to be completed, again, there'll be one final little PowerPoint tomorrow to kind of wrap things up with Unit 3. Again, by tomorrow, you need to finish your raft writing assignment. I checked today, and not a lot of people have submitted their stuff yet. Remember, you have to submit it through Classroom by the end of the school day tomorrow. Just hit that turn in button at the top. You do have the optional Unit 3 review packet out there for you guys to work on, because Wednesday, online assessment. It's the first one of these that we'll have, and maybe that's how we'll go forward, but we'll see how things pan out in the next couple of weeks. What you're going to be expected to do with that online assessment is you're going to be writing up short paragraphs to a series of questions. You need to be looking through the old info. Again, you're only going to be allowed to complete that online assessment on the day. So you got to start budgeting time right now to make sure that that gets completed on Wednesday if you want to earn the credit. You definitely want to earn the credit. The final reminder, and I'll remind you every day, is your local history interview needs to be done by Monday at 4:20. Again, by the end of the day, you got to submit that audio and your final draft of questions to me as soon as possible. That's